rotations. All right. So let's start with this section, okay? So some of you might have already gotten some of this. And if you didn't, just tag along. All right, so first thing, remember the questions we have to ask is rotation around what? Yeah. 2, which direction? And 3, how many degrees? So, first of all, we have to figure out which of these two is the original. Remember, when we did translations, it's the same thing. We look at the letter. So pick a letter. I don't know, Q, S, D, V. Pick one. It doesn't matter which one. I'm going to pick Q right here. And this one. This one says Q and this one says Q prime. So obviously, this shape right here, this one, is the original one. And this is the image. This one is the image after the rotation. So this is the copy, the image. Okay. So this is the original. What happened? Well, obviously it's a rotation. So pick a point, just focus on one point, and ask yourself, where did it go? Well, it went from here to here, so it's rotating this direction. And if you're going that direction, we can say it's counterclockwise, right? And then ask yourself, point Q, which was in quadrant 1, where is it now? Point Q that's in quadrant 1. Point Q, who is in quadrant 1, it is now, after a rotation, in quadrant 2. So remember, we do rotations in increments of 90 degrees. So point Q traveled one full quadrant. It went from quadrant 1 to quadrant 2. And if it only travels one quadrant, it's a 90-degree rotation. And that is going to apply for everybody else. Look at point S is in quadrant 1, and it is now in quadrant 2. It traveled one quadrant. Point D, now point D, right, is in quadrant 4, right? But where did it end up? In quadrant 1. So it traveled from quadrant 4 to quadrant 1, again, just one quadrant. So that is a 90 degree. So everybody traveled counterclockwise one quadrant over. So the rule, or not the rule, but the description of the rotation is counterclockwise 90 degrees. Pick another color. Let's focus, let's pick a letter. Let's pick letter B here. That one says B prime and this one says B. So this is the original triangle, and this is the image, the copy. Okay, so again, focus on one point because it's going to apply for all the other points. So point B is in quadrant 3. Quadrant 3, and it went to quadrant 2. So point B, who is right here, went to quadrant 2. It traveled one quadrant over. Which direction? Well, that direction. So it went clockwise. And because it only traveled one quadrant over, it is a 90-degree rotation. Sorry, I forgot the first one. Rotation around what? Well, they're all rotating about the origin right here. Okay, so imagine a string, right? Like the tetherball game. Imagine a string, and they're all rotating around the origin. So think of this as the sun, and this little triangle thing as a planet that's going around that sun. Okay. TGI undergoes a rotation of 180 degrees. Okay, which quadrant would triangle G? Did I just say TGI? Which quadrant would triangle GHI end up in? Well, let's focus on one point. Let's focus on point G here. If it's going to travel 180 degrees, that means it's going to move over 2 full quadrants. So point G, and everybody else is going to follow suit. So point G is going to travel one quadrant, and then it's going to travel another quadrant. So point G, who is in quadrant 1 right now, will end up in quadrant 3. Right? So is every point that is in quadrant 1, they will all end up in quadrant 3. So which quadrant would GHI end up in? Everybody is going to end up here in quadrant 3. Okay? What is the orientation? Well, 180 degrees. So if it's 180 degrees, so if it's right now it's 100, and if you ask the triangle to rotate 100 degrees, it is now going to look like this, where G is going to be over here, H and I. And we have something that looks like that. G pointing down, yeah, H and I right here. Okay. All right, so this one we actually have to do some work. So let's get the points here. Points W is -8, -8 and what? And 6. X is, well, you know what? I'll tell you in class. Remind that this should be right here, so that's we don't have any issues with decimals. All right, so this is going to be X is going to be -3, comma 8. Where's Y? Y is -2 and 6. And Z is -3, comma 4. After 100, and so we step back, it's 180 degrees, so let's focus on one point. So X, well, they're all in quadrant 2 right now. Everybody's in quadrant 2, right? The whole arrow is in quadrant 2. If it's going to travel 180 degrees, it doesn't matter if it's clockwise or counterclockwise, because the arrow is going to travel 2 quadrants. So it's going to go travel 1 quadrant, and then it's going to travel to that quadrant. If you went the other way, one quadrant, it still ends up in quadrant 4. So it doesn't matter which way you turn. It's 180 degrees, and it's going to end up here. So you can remember the rule. You can use the table that we created in class for the rule, or you can remember the little trick that I did in class. So let me just label this: W prime, X prime, Y prime, and Z prime. So the little trick I told you in class is that for every quadrant that the point moves, right, you switch these numbers twice. You switch the numbers. So, for example, -8 and 6 is going to jump 1, and it's going to jump another quadrant. It's going to end up in this quadrant, right? So, what it's end up happening, 8 and 6 is going to switch places, become 6 and 8. And then another quadrant, those two numbers switch again, becomes 8 and 6. And when it lands here in quadrant 4, we take the characteristic of quadrant 4. I mean, quadrant 4, the first number is positive and the second number is negative. So we're going to write +8, -6. So W prime becomes 8, comma, -6. Okay? Or if you remember the rule, XY, it's going to be -x and -y. I don't know which one you rather do. -3 and 8. Okay, if you remember the rule, it's going to end up 3 and 8, but the signs change. So -3 was positive, negative is now positive, and 8, who was positive, is now negative. You just switch the sign. So this becomes 2 -6, and this becomes 3 -4. Again, if you can remember this, right, that's the rule for a 180 degree rotation, right? You change the sign of the x coordinate and y coordinate, whatever they were, just change it to its opposite. So let's plot the points. So W prime is 8 and -6, so 8 and -6 is right here. We're going to call this W prime. 3 and -8. 3 and -8 is right here. And what is that? X prime. 2 and negative 6. 2 and negative 6 is right here. And what is that? That's our Y prime. And 3 and negative 4. 3 and negative 4 is right here. And that is our Z prime. And if you connect the dots, look. It's a 180-degree rotation. The arrow is pointing the other way. Okay. 4. So we want a 90-degree counterclockwise. So 90 degrees means counterclockwise, which means first of all we gotta go this direction. We go this direction against the clock, and we're gonna go 90 degrees. 90 degrees counterclockwise rotation means that all these points will jump over one quadrant. So this whole quadrilateral will go from quadrant 2, and because it's only a 90-degree rotation, it goes from one quadrant to the following one. Okay. Give me 1 second. One moment. Right, so over here, well, let's write the coordinates first. So point A is negative 2 and 6. Point B is 0 and 2. Point C is negative 6 and 2. Point D is negative 8 and 6. Okay, so if you remember the little trick I told you, every time a point jumps over one quadrant, all you gotta do, let's look at point A. Point A is right now negative 2 and 6. It's gonna go jump one quadrant, right? There's only a 90-degree rotation. So all you have to do is switch the numbers once. So that becomes 6 and 2. We don't have to worry about the sign. So we know it becomes 6 and 2. We switch these two numbers once, it becomes 6 and 2. But in quadrant 3 over here, what are the characteristics of the coordinates here? Well, in quadrant 3, everybody's negative. So you write negative 6, negative 2. 0 and 2 switches over, becomes 2 and 0. Right? I'm sorry, this becomes negative 2 and 0. Negative 6 and 2, if you switch negative 6 and 2, it becomes 2 and 6. And again, it's going to be in quadrant 3, so everybody's negative. And then negative 8 and 6, switch the positions, becomes 6 and 8. And in this case, everybody is negative. Let's start plotting this. So we get negative 2 and 6, negative 2 and 6, 0 and 2. Sorry, negative 2 and 0. Negative 2 and 6. What did I do wrong here? Sorry. Start again. Negative 6 and 2 is this way. And that's point A prime. Negative 2 and 0 is this guy over here. And that's negative 2 and 0 is this guy over here. And that's B prime. Negative 2 and negative 6 is over here. And that's C prime. And then negative 6, negative 8. Where is it? It's right here. And that is D prime. So let's connect the dots. And you have your rotation. So we went and the next one is, oh, now we're describing each transformation. Didn't we just do this? Weird. Okay. So again, pick a point. I'm going to focus on point T. So this is T, which makes this guy, this is T, F, and B, which makes this. This is the original one, and this is the rotated image, right? The copy image, the rotated image. Okay, so we know that T went from quadrant 3 to quadrant 2, so the rotation went this way. Right, so this is a clockwise rotation. And every point, as you can tell, move only one quadrant. They went from quadrant 3 to quadrant 2. And if it's only moving one quadrant, it's a 90-degree rotation. So this is a clockwise 90-degree rotation. Here, I know it looks messy, so pick one that's like away from all the mess. I'm going to focus on D. Look, kind of far away, and then D prime here. So we know this is the original. And this is the rotated image. Okay. Don't worry, pick just a point and focus on that one, because everybody else will follow the same rotation. Rotated image. So where is point D? Point D is in quadrant 3 right now. And where does it go? It goes from quadrant 3 to quadrant 4. So point D moved over one quadrant. Which direction? This direction. So it's, first of all, it's counterclockwise. It's 90 degrees because it's just one quadrant, right? So every time you move only one quadrant over, it's a 90-degree, because we only do it by increments of 90 degrees. So it's a 90-degree rotation. And which direction? Counterclockwise. So everybody. So look at point F. Point F, which is, actually point F is on the axis. It went from one axis to the other axis. Point P went from quadrant 3 to quadrant 2. And point G is actually in quadrant 2. And where does it go? To quadrant 1. And regardless, it's still one quadrant over. Okay. 7. So again, by now you should be okay doing this. Let's find the original. This is the original one, because it doesn't have the primes, and this one has G prime, E prime, S prime, H prime. So this is the rotated image. So pick a point, and let's focus on H here. H is in quadrant 4, and it went from quadrant 4 to quadrant 1, and from quadrant 1 it went to quadrant 2. So it went 2 quadrants over. So when it travels 2 quadrants, it's a 180-degree rotation. And doesn't matter which way you say, if it's clockwise or counterclockwise, it doesn't. It still lands in the same spot. So even if you said, hey, we're rotating this direction, notice that it still lands in quadrant 2. Okay. Next one. Again, locate the original, and this is the original. Okay, so you can see that all the points are just N, X, K, and I. The other one is I prime, N prime, K prime, X prime. So we know this is the copy or the rotated image. So focus on one point. Let's focus on point N. Point N right here is in quadrant 1. And now it's going to go where? It's going to go to quadrant 2. So point N, travel one quadrant over. And which direction? First of all, it went counterclockwise. And when it just travels one quadrant over, clockwise, it means it traveled 90 degrees. And everybody also went counterclockwise 90 degrees. Point E, question, not pointing, question 9. Pick a point, again, point that you can clearly see here. So that's N, this is E, and that's B, and that's V, which makes this the original. And this one over here, the rotated image. Right, so this is the first thing you have to do. So let's focus on point N. Here's point N, and here's N prime. So N went from quadrant 3, right, to quadrant 2. That's one quadrant over, which means it only traveled 90 degrees. So this is a clockwise 90-degree rotation. Okay. This one, oh, thank God, it's nice and clear. Let's focus on point U. Here's point U, point B, and point I. So this is the original one. Everybody else here on the second triangle has a prime, so it's B prime, U prime, I prime. So this is the rotated image. And I can, hopefully you guys can see right off the bat that this is a 180-degree rotation. So if you focus, let's focus on point I here. Point I traveled one quadrant and another quadrant. It went from quadrant 2 to quadrant 4. So that's 2 quadrants over. And remember, every 90 degrees equals 1 quadrant. So this is 180 degrees. And which direction? It doesn't matter because it's 180. So clockwise or counter, whichever one you say.